Welcome to all the participants. This session is on from boardroom to courtroom, lessons from Tata history. Let me introduce the panel before we dig deep into the ruling and the nuances related to the same. So I am Nishchal Joshipura and I co-head the M&A and P practice at NDA. I have been joined by my three Desai, who is resolution practice and is an expert on board matters. Also, I have a senior member of National Association, and I'm also joined by my colleague Shupratim Guha, who is a senior member in our corporate team and who specializes in corporate governance matters. In today's session, we will cover 5 or 6 things. The first one will be the sequence of events right from 1868 when the Tata Group was set up till 2021. The second uh, uh, to cover is whether certain restrictive provisions in the Articles of Association of Tata Sons can be held valid or invalid. Are affirmative vote rights valid or invalid? And this becomes very important, especially for private equity community, given that most of their investments, hinge on the affirmative vote items for protection of their minority interest. The fourth one will be, I'll request Vyapak to give his different perspective on Supreme Court ruling. And the last, we will also deal with how to remove directors from the board, because this is a question which keeps coming up from all our clients on, how do we remove a director from the board of the company without any issues. Now, as we all know, this is a landmark case involving one of the most reputed groups in India, that is Tata Group. As some of you may know, Tata Group was formed in 1868, and in its history of 144 years, there were only 5 chairmen of Tata Group who were from the Tata family. So it started with Mr. Jamshedji Tata, then Sir Dorab Tata became the chairman. After him, Mr. Nauroji Saklatwala became the chairman. So almost 144 years of the history of Tata Group, there are only 5 chairmen within the Tata Group family. For the first time, a leap of faith was taken by Tata Group to induct an outsider, that is outsider from the Tata Group family, to take the reins of the Tata Group. And that's where Mr. Cyrus Mistry was inducted as the deputy chairman and chairman of Tata Sons and the Tata Group in 2012. Now, the way this Supreme Court ruling happened was there were about 15 civil appeals that were filed. 14 of them were filed by Tata Group and 1 civil appeal was filed by the SP Group, that is the Shapoorji Pallonji. And interestingly, on all the 15 appeals, the ruling was given in favor of Tata Group. The ruling is so sweeping that it's interesting to notice some of the statements made by Supreme Court, and I'll give you 3 instances. There was one place where it was being discussed on the ouster of Mr. Mistry from the board and whether that was valid or not. And Supreme Court made this observation that someone who gained entry through the very same door cannot condemn it when asked to exit through that door. There was another instance where the Supreme Court was appreciating Tata Group for having got an outsider within the to take control of Tata Group, and mentioned that it's not easy for somebody of the stature of Mr. Ratan Tata to give up a significant position within the group. And Supreme Court made this observation that today nobody wants to step down from any office except if afflicted by a brain stroke or a sunstroke. And the third interesting statement that was made was by Supreme Court was when the discussion happened on whether certain business decisions taken by Tata Group were they resulting in operation and mismanagement for SP Group or not. And while discussing those things, Supreme Court made an interesting statement that in fact it may be conceded today by Tata Sons that one important decision that the board took on 16th of March 2012, that is the date when Mr. Mistry was inducted as the deputy chairman of Tata Sons, certainly turned out to be a wrong decision of lifetime for Tata Group. So very interesting observations by Supreme Court, and without much ado, I will start asking questions to the panelists. We have interestingly, even before the session started, uh, with them once our panel discussion is over. But let me start with Payal. Payal, if you can just run the audience through the sequence of events right from 1868 to 2021, because that will set the tone for the panel discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nishchal. A very good afternoon to everyone. And as rightly mentioned by Nishchal, I think it's very important for us to look at the entire sequence of events and how the entire issue unfolded, moving from the boardroom to the courtroom, how the entire thing has transpired. I hope my screen is visible to everyone.
Yes.
So as already mentioned by Nishchal, it started way back in 1868 when the Tata Group was founded. Later on, the Tata Trust was set up in 1919, which was preceded by only starting a private limited company, which is the Tata Sons Limited, which happens to be the parent group itself. The other entities, that is the SP Group, the Shapoorji Pallonji Group, came into picture a lot later. And this happened primarily because of the interpersonal relationships with the Tata family that the two entities, Cyrus Investments Private Limited and Sterling Investment Corporation Private, came into the picture in 1965. Interestingly, despite their entry in 1965, it was only in 1980 when Shri Pallonji Mistry was appointed as the non-executive director on the board of Tata Sons. Before we move further ahead, we will take a pause and look at an interesting aspect, which is the Articles of Association of Tata Sons itself. Now, the Articles of Association, obviously over a period of a century, underwent several amendments, of which some involved members of the Tata family, the trust, as well as other Tata companies, as well as the Shapoorji Pallonji Group. Now, we have tried to put together the relevant articles itself, which were dealt with in the series of rulings from NCLT to NCLAT and the Supreme Court. And at this stage, before we get into the detail of it, we will deal very briefly what these important articles were. One of the articles which was a bone of contention in the rulings itself was Article 75, which provided for a power to transfer the shares of a company by a shareholder by a special resolution without giving notice. Now, mind you, the reason we are focusing on these specific articles, which is on transfer of ordinary shares or about the quorum requirements, the ability of trustees of Tata Trust to nominate their directors on the board, them to collectively hold at least 40% of the paid up equity capital, as well as and having the ability to select the executive chairman, ability to have an affirmative board rights as well, so that all decisions on the board of directors are taken only with the affirmative consent of the majority of the trust nominated directors. And it had to be mandatorily brought before the board. And when it came before the board, the trust nominated directors, being in majority, had an affirmative voting right. The reason these articles are of a lot of significance is because each one of them were brought in, maybe at the outset itself in the company petition or introduced at a later stage, seeking for deletion, striking off, and even going to the extent that these articles itself were oppressive and were against the minority shareholders. Now, how it unfolded, we will wait for the webinar to proceed. Moving back to the sequence, as I mentioned earlier, it was from 1980 onwards that Cyrus Mistry's father was already on the board. There were articles, amendments which were taking place. Now, one of the significant amendments took place in 13 September 2000. when we saw an amendment to the Article 75, which was in relation to the transfer of the shares itself, which was unanimously approved by the board. And it included the consent of the SP group as well. We also saw the introduction of other articles in relation to the affirmative vote action. Moving along, in 2006, on 10th of August, we saw Cyrus Mistry being appointed as the non-executive director on the board. In 2012, Cyrus Mistry was appointed as the executive deputy chairman of Tata Sons for a period of 5 years. This was approved by the shareholders itself in August 2012. And at the end of December 2012, it's when he was redesignated as the executive chairman from 29 December, and Mr. Ratan Tata was designated as the chairman emeritus. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning itself, we see amendments to the articles, and it happened right from 2000 to 2014 as well, all along having either Mr. Shapur Palanji being on the board itself or Mr. Cyrus Mistry party to these resolutions, which approved the amendments to the articles. Taking a few steps ahead, we reach 2016. In 2016 October is when the drama starts unfolding a little bit, when we see Mr. Cyrus Mistry being replaced as the executive chairman. And it's only at this stage that it's only the removal as an executive chairman. But this brought in a lot of repercussions. We saw an email being out which talked about lack of corporate governance issues within the Tata family, within the Tata group, the directors of the company not complying with their fiduciary duties, which compelled Tata Sons to issue a formal press statement itself, leading to the removal of Mr. Cyrus Mistry as a director by the shareholders of Tata Industries, Tata Consultancy Services, and Tata Teleservices. With the turn of events and the movement regarding his removal from the board of various companies, Mr. Cyrus Mistry himself resigned from the board of several other Tata Group entities itself, followed by filing the company petition in December 2016 before NCLT, making a case for oppression and mismanagement. At this stage, his removal was only as the removal as an executive chairman on the board of Tata Sons. This fact is relevant because at the time of the filing of the petition, he was still on the board as a director. He was later removed as a director from the board of Tata Sons in February 2017 and also appointed a new person in his place as the MD itself and chairman. How did the drama unfold before the NCLT? It was not a simpliciter run where you file the NCLT, a company petition, and you move forward. NCLT at the outset rejected the petition and held it was non-maintainable because these companies did not meet the eligibility criteria of filing an application for oppression and mismanagement. They did not have the requisite qualifications or could not fulfill the cause of action itself. So they dismissed the application as well as the separate application seeking waiver itself. This is how it progressed till April of 2017. Obviously, this does not see the light of the day. As a result, the Shapurji Palanji group went ahead and appealed this decision before the NCLAT itself, as well as the decision where the waiver application was rejected. Moving on, NCLT allowed the appeal, which was filed by the Shapurji Palanji group, saying that in this particular instance, considering the share of capital of the company, the amount which was invested by this group required them that they could file an application on behalf of the minority and maintain a case of oppression and mismanagement. So they remanded the matter back for disposal before the NCLT. Now, the Shapurji Palanji group, on the grounds of having some bias, felt the matter needs to be transferred and tried their luck even getting the matter transferred before the NCLT Delhi bench, which was rejected and a cost was imposed on them. This led the matter back to the Mumbai bench of NCLT itself, where obviously NCLT on most counts itself ruled in favor of Tata Sons and said that the removal, which happened as the chairman, was due to loss of trust. There were other issues which were dealt with more from a factual perspective, which were claimed as an oppression mismanagement case itself, and all the issues were held in favor of Tata, leading to the appeal before the NCLAT in August 2018. However, NCLAT admitted this particular petition, and they also admitted the separate application which was filed by Mr. Cyrus Mistry, and all these appeals were heard together. In December 2019, NCLAT allowed the appeal in favor of the SP group itself, and they said that Mr. Cyrus Mistry needs to be reinstated for the remainder of his tenure. The resolution for removal was illegal, as well as the decision on the conversion of the company itself was also illegal, along with dealing with few other issues with respect to the Articles of Association. Interestingly, the NCLAT did not go into various other factual aspects which were dealt with by NCLT in relation to oppression and mismanagement. With this win, obviously, as Nishchal already mentioned, it went to a series of appeals being filed before the Supreme Court in January 2020. And Supreme Court again giving a sweeping judgment in favor of the Tata Group in March 2021, allowing all the 14 appeals and dismissing only the appeal which was filed by the SP Group itself. Interestingly, just a few days before this particular webinar, it again made the news, and as obviously known to world, that a review petition has been filed before the Supreme Court by the SP Group challenging the Supreme Court decision. So that's where we are coming from 1886 back to 2021, the series of events, how they have unfolded.
Thanks a lot, Payal. My next question is to Supratim. I think the heart of the dispute has been oppression and mismanagement. Could you throw light on what all arguments were made by the SP Group with respect to oppression and management, and what was Supreme Court's reaction to those arguments?
Hi, thanks Nishchal for the question, and good afternoon to the audience. So one of the key issues that was decided on by the Supreme Court as far as this ruling was concerned was whether or not affairs at Tata Sons, which is the primary holding company for the Tata Group, was indeed being conducted in a manner that was prejudicial to the interests of the minority shareholders, namely the Shapoorji Pallonji Group. And that's essentially forming two questions of law that the Supreme Court really looked at while answering, the questions that were raised. The first one is essentially to do with whether or not matters that were conducted at, the Tata Sons indeed amounted to oppression of minority shareholders, especially given that, NCLAT tribunal had not specifically overturned any of the findings that had been made by NCLT, which, as Payal had mentioned, did not specifically find any allegation that had been raised against Tata Sons to be particularly oppressive to the minority shareholders. The second question that was dealt with on the same topic was whether or not ultimately the relief that was granted by NCLAT to Mr. Mistry and the Pallonji Group, was that even within the scope of the mandate that NCLAT has under the Companies Act. Now, with that, I'll move into what exactly, for the benefit of the audience who may not be fully aware of the technicalities of oppression and mismanagement suits, what exactly forms oppression and what remedies there might be under law. I'll deal with that for a minute or two before moving into exactly what the case had about it. Now, in order for a case of oppression or mismanagement to be really made out, a member must really need to demonstrate that the affairs of the company of which he or she is a member are being or have been, that is past or in the present and on a continuous basis, being conducted in a manner really prejudicial to the interests of the members, or prejudicial to public interest at large, or prejudicial to the interests of the company itself. Once this is demonstrated, the member would then need to go ahead and demonstrate whether or not, basis the facts that have been demonstrated, it is just and equitable for the company to be wound up, and if so, and if rather the company were to be wound up, that winding up would amount to amount to an unfair prejudice to the interests of the member or the members making the complaint. Given this entire test, what really amounts to, what really needs to be shown to the court or the tribunal is that there has been misconduct in the past, or that it is being, the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner that is prejudicial to the complainant or company at large in the present. And these can't be really one-off. It has to be continuous. There has to be an overarching theme of there being a plan to oppress the minority shareholders or to otherwise extricate rights of a particular stakeholder group or the company in itself. If that isn't done, simply something that is a commercial decision, or there being a mere change in the management, as in this case, that shouldn't necessarily amount to an oppression of minority interests. So that's the brief on the law. As far as the case is concerned, what the Shapoorji Group had actually alleged, broadly speaking, were 2 points at the NCLT level. One was that the affairs of the Tata Sons company was being carried on as a proprietary concern of Mr. Ratan Tata. And two, that given these circumstances, it's just and equitable to have Tata Sons wound up, but that that such winding up would ultimately unfairly prejudice the Shapoorji Group. Specifically, what they pointed out was that one, that there were certain articles in charter documents which were abusive in nature and which were essentially oppressive to the minorities. It gave the Tata trusts, which were the majority shareholders of Tata Sons, unfair control over the company and of the board of directors. Two, that Mr. Mistri's removal as chairman was something that amounted to oppression. And three, that certain business transactions that had been carried on by Tata Sons with related parties or third-party acquisitions were really at the whims and fancies of certain individuals and really didn't have commercial rationale behind it. Now, as far as the first point is concerned, which is around the charter documents and the provisions therein, that it has been sort of commented upon at a later stage and discuss that over the course of this webinar. I'll just move on to the next 2 or 3 main topics that were covered in the first 2 questions that I'm dealing with. One is on business transactions. The court, while reviewing the allegations that were leveled, as far as business transactions were concerned, found that NCLAT, in its judgment, had never really opened up the findings, the fact findings that had been made by NCLT around certain acquisitions that had been done by the Tata Group. These were high-profile acquisitions in their Tata Motors division or in the Power and Energy division. The NCLT didn't find anything wrong there. There were certain supposed related party transactions, which again, was essentially found to be fine, that there was no unfair dealing or unjust enrichment that had taken place by certain individuals in the management, and that allegations around terrorist financing or unfair dealings as far as their aviation joint ventures are concerned with AirAsia and Vistara Singapore were also fine, and that allegations were really unfounded. Given these, the Supreme Court considered that business transaction related allegations brought in by the Shapoorji Group were unfounded. They were fine basis the fact that NCLAT did not reopen them and therefore merited no further discussion. On the second point, that the Supreme Court found to be really the triggering factor as far as this entire drama was concerned, that had unfolded over the last 3-4 years, this from the position or the office of the executive chairman of the Tata Sons board, while reinstatement of Mr. Mistry was never really pleaded, that was found to be really the proxima or the trigger point for this entire court battle that had taken place. Now, as far as the removal was concerned, what the Supreme Court held was that, see, his removal was from the position of the executive chairman of the board and not from the office of a director. And that in itself was a key distinction. An executive chairman is essentially a post that has been created under the charter documents of Tata Sons. It's an executive position, yes, he is an officer of the company, yes, but he is not a director, and therefore there are no specific statutory provisions or protections or due process that needs to be followed from a company law perspective for his removal. There were certain provisions relating to the selection of Mr. Mistry to the board, but his removal was really dependent on certain affirmative votes coming in from Tata Sons. Now, as far as his removal was concerned, in addition to the fact that there was, there were no key protections that were available to Mr. Mistry, what the Supreme Court also did not way in which the history of that few months in late 2016 evolved was the fact that following the ouster from the post of the chairman, there were certain leaks of confidential emails liaising with revenue authorities around sensitive tax positions for the Tata Sons group, outside approved board processes which Mr. Mistry had initiated apparently. And given all of this, it was found that those things did not go down well with the court, especially when the court really balanced conduct versus what the court thought was apparently fair treatment by Tata Sons over the last 3 decades, where Tata Sons had actually given the Shapoorji Pallonji Group representation on the board. Mr. Mistry Senior, that is Mr. Cyrus Mistry's father, Mr. Cyrus Mistry himself, were members of the board since the early 2000s. Mr. Mistry was also anointed as the successor to Mr. Ratan Tata and went on to become his successor. Given all of these facts and the conduct that was sort of noted down by the Supreme Court, it went into the entire corporate history of the Tata Group since the date the Shapoorji Pallonji Group joined the board. It held that there is no real merit in what the concern that was raised around the exit or the ouster of Mr. Mistry was concerned. Now, as far as the finding that was made, the NCLAT had in its judgment also found that it was just and equitable that Tata Sons be wound up, given that a case of oppression had been made out. The Supreme Court really went into what the NCLAT had seen there. And what it noted was what the NCLAT had relied on was particular judgments from English courts, which had essentially laid down that if it is made out that the affairs of a company or the governance of a company are carried on in a very obfuscatory manner with the intention of denying shareholders or stakeholders or depriving these stakeholders of their just rights, then in that case it is fair to also go ahead and say that there is a case made out for fair and equitable winding up. Moreover, what it then went on to say that established jurisprudence in this area already holds out 2 separate branches of thought or 2 circumstances in which winding up on a just and equitable basis can be made. One is where what is called a functional deadlock between shareholders. That is where there is an intractable breakdown between the relationship between majority and minority shareholders is concerned. Or the second position could be where there is a quasi-partnership that has been discovered. Now, in this case, what NCLAT had gone on to hold is that basis certain English rulings, it was found or it believed that Tata Sons, the shareholding, and given the history between the Pallonji Group and the Tata Group, that there was a quasi-partnership that was involved. And that basis the fact that there was a breakdown of complete trust between the partners of this quasi-partnership, It was just an equitable that Tata Sons be wound up. Now, the Supreme Court disagreed there and struck down the NCLAT ruling for the simple reason that, when it comes to cases of quasi-partnership, these are really more, if I were to take an example, more relevant for joint ventures, or where there is an established history between shareholders prior to the formation of a company. Given that, Shapoorji Group, as Payal had, delineated earlier, came in almost, 100 years or more after the Tata Group had really been founded. It's difficult for us or anyone to really say going ahead that there was quasi-partnership. They were more or less an investor or a minority shareholder, but it's difficult to really, say that the threshold for satisfying what a quasi-partnership would be was ever met. The last that was dealt with by the Supreme Court on the O&M side was with respect to the powers of the NCLAT and whether or not reinstatement of Mr. Palunji, I'm sorry, Mr. Mistry to the board was correct. And now, stepping back to what the law really says is that if let's say a tribunal were to form an opinion that matters of a company were indeed carried on in a manner prejudicial to stakeholders, company, or public interest at large, the tribunal can then step in, intervene in that situation, and then pass orders that the team fit with the aim, and this is important, with the aim to end the matters that are being complained. In this case, what, amongst other things, more importantly, what the NCLAT did was to reinstate Mr. Mistry to the Tata Sons board and board of several other group companies from which he had resigned or had been removed following the 2016 events that had unfolded at that time. Given that, what the Supreme Court went on to look at was whether or not reinstating someone made sense, whether NCLAT even had the ability or the mandate under law to really reinstate someone. On the first point, it was held that Mr. Mistry actually held the post of executive chairman under the aegis of the board, and was which appointment as the executive chairman was also approved by the shareholders, and that appointment and that tenure was for a period of 5 years. Given that this the NCLAT ruling came in late 2019, and Mr. Mistry's tenure, the first tenure that he would have served as chairman of the Tata Sons board, had ended in 2017, the Supreme Court found that it made no sense for him to be reinstated on the board when the course of his office had actually run out. And that is actually established law. There are several rulings which say that an office, once its tenure has run out, courts cannot intervene and reappoint someone whose tenure would normally have ended. On the second point, as far as whether or not the NCLAT had the power to reappoint someone, it was found that, see, 242, which essentially lays down these powers, gives the NCLAT a wide-ranging mandate, which is essentially to put an end to matters which are oppressive in nature. It then goes on to really list down certain items or certain powers that the NCLT or the tribunal has as far as oppression and mismanagement is concerned. And these include matters to regulate governance at the company level, essentially change the composition of a board of directors. If you look at 242, you'll see the entire list of powers that are there. These would include, removal of the managing director or appointing a director with the mandate to, keep filing reports with the tribunal. It also enables the tribunal to take certain other actions as far as the governance is concerned to ensure that things are brought back to normal. What the court, however, held is that while there is a wide-ranging mandate under law, there is no mandate that the NCLAT has to reinstate someone to the board, especially when that reinstatement is basis a contract for personal services, and that which is something that is prohibited under the Specific Relief Act, which is so essentially what that would imply is that courts are not competent to really enforce a a contract for personal services. In this case, Mr. Mistry being, a person anointed by the board as the chairman, and essentially, requiring certain commercial as well as legal qualifications to be met, would not be competent to have him reinstated. That's essentially the position that the Supreme Court took as far as as far as oppression and mismanagement is concerned. Initial
Thanks, Shubhra, for the detailed analysis on oppression and mismanagement. Payal, Article 75 has been much talked about since the time the dispute began. Can you throw light on what was the issue with Article 75 and why was it challenged, and what was Supreme Court's view on that?
Thank you, Nishchal. So as I mentioned at the outset itself, there were a couple of articles which we had shown on the screen as well, which were termed as per se oppressive, and out of which one of them was Article 75, which was in relation to the company's power to transfer shares, which said that it could be done by a special resolution and it would be deemed that the notice has been given. Now, keeping aside the article, I think the issues which came up where this was not something which was raised at the outset itself. By way of an amendment, this argument was later taken up. Second, there was no pleading or any averment to show the fact that there was ever any act in the last 100 years where there has been an abuse of power under this article, or they could show any kind of conduct which reflected that the article has been used in a manner which has been oppressive or prejudicial when it comes to the minority itself. In the absence of anything of that sort, the issue arises whether NCLAT itself has a power to mute the operation of a particular article itself. While going into this analysis, how the Supreme Court dealt with it is firstly understand what is an article of association itself. It's the contract which is there between the company and its shareholders itself. Interestingly, when we dealt with the sequence of events, I had mentioned the fact that at which stage these articles underwent amendment, who were party to the resolutions when these amendments had taken place, whether the SP group was part of it, whether Mr. Cyrus Mistry or his father had approved these changes to the amendments or not. Now, when it comes to this Article 75, as it stands today, it was obviously passed in the resolution where the Mistry family was part of. And they had never raised these issues at that stage with respect to the amendment. And their argument was that the very purpose of this insertion was to ensure that there is proper corporate governance. But today, when it came to this particular litigation, the challenge became that it could be used in future in a manner which could be oppressive. So it was about dealing with the future conduct itself, which led to the question of what is the scope and power under Section 241 itself for the tribunal. Now, NCLAT had rightly said that when it comes to the articles of association itself, its legality or illegality is not something they, on a basis of the first principles itself, can rule on that particular issue. However, they went a step forward and did say that they cannot, this power which is provided under Article 75, they had muted this power and said that this will not be available to them. The Supreme Court said NCLAT has gone beyond its powers when it came to this particular Article 75. So because the Section 241, the purpose of that is not to bring about a discipline in the management system itself as to how the articles should operate, what should the articles itself be. When in the absence of any kind of arguments to show that there has been a conduct in the past or in the present where they have been misutilizing this power under particular articles, you cannot intervene and go ahead and actually set aside certain rights which are available to the shareholders under their charter documents itself. So this article was, this decision of the NCLAT where they muted the power under this particular articles was also set aside by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, interestingly, along with Article 75, there was another article which was dealt with was the 118, which talks about the selection committee, their interpretation itself, and reading it along with the affirmative votes right, which we will deal in the next part itself.
Thanks, Payal. So, Vyapak, next question is to you. Uh, as we all know, the affirmative voting rights are very crucial for all the investors, given that it's a significant part of the rights package for any investor or acquirer. Could you throw light on what was SP Group's allegation with respect to the affirmative rights held by Tata Trust and the nominees on the board of Tata Sons? And what was Supreme
Sure.
Court's view on that?
Sure. Thanks, Nishal, and thank you, Supratim and Payal, for that elaborate understanding of the judgment. But I at least personally feel that the most important and the controversial, observations of the Honorable Supreme Court are in relation to this article, which is the affirmative rights. And as you rightly said, affirmative rights are used in very different contexts, right? One, it is used when an investor comes in, and the investor may be a minority shareholder but has certain affirmative rights. In the context and the facts of this matter, it was the other way around. The affirmative rights were in the context of a majority shareholder, right? So, the facts are very different, the settings are very different, and therefore, obviously, the ruling which has come in light of those facts, may not apply in many other situations. So I think there are, several debates and criticisms and, support coming out in reference to this article. Let me put, things in context. What does the article specifically say, right? It simply says that matters before any meeting of the board, which are required to be decided by the majority of directors, shall require the affirmative vote of a majority of directors appointed by the Tata Trusts at the meeting. Okay, so basically what it means is, at one level, Tata Trust has an right to appoint 1/3 of the board, and at the second level, when certain decisions are taken by the board, the affirmative vote of the majority of such appointed board and board members and present at the meeting is important to take that decision. Now, at the first, there is a majority shareholder. If they are actually holding more than 51% or 75% in a non-listed entity, maybe private limited and public is a controversial aspect in matter of this case, but let's assume it's a private limited company and unlisted, obviously, then having such a right doesn't sound to be very controversial. But what did the SP Group challenged is that such rights are not exercised in the manner bona fide, and they are prejudicial to the minority shareholders in the company because of the way and manner in which they are exercised in the case in hand, and also it can be done in future. Now, as we always say in law, right, hard facts make bad law. Maybe this is not a bad law. I'm not suggesting this is a bad law, but definitely the facts considered by the Honorable Supreme Court are very, very peculiar. What do they consider as a background to come to a conclusion that such affirmative votes are okay? First, how the SP Group have behaved in the litigation. So they say at first they initially made a prayer that the whole article should be deleted. Somewhere down the line, they said, no, only the portion which requires affirmative vote should be deleted. NCLAT went a step further, or maybe a step sidewards, and gave a ruling to say Ratan Tata and others should not take certain decisions in advance, which has nothing to do with this article, but some prayer like that was granted, which was never a prayer in the first place. And then in the appeal, and the words used by Supreme Court is that the ever-changing stands of SP Group. and they say also that this is funny and whatever they felt in that context. But they said that SP Group is now actually asking for equal board representation and an affirmative vote in their favor. So they said that, look, a person who originally said affirmative vote is prejudicial to other shareholders is now changing its stand to come back and say, no, keep the affirmative vote, but at least give it to me as well. So I think this was the background in which Supreme Court was dealing with this issue, and that has to be kept in mind. Second point, which the Supreme Court for the purpose of dealing with this issue is one of course, it said that Tata Group is obviously not a listed entity. And second, and I don't know whether it is honestly relevant for the discussion of this issue, but it went very heavily in the minds of Supreme Court that Tata Group, being an investing company and not an operating company, ultimate shareholders being charity, right? Having such affirmative voting rights, may not be prejudicial to start with. Now, frankly speaking, the activity or the business of the company has nothing to do with this issue, but that was heavily relied upon and referred to by the Supreme Court in its ruling to come to the conclusion that there is nothing wrong so far as the affirmative votes are concerned. The other aspect, which is, in my view, even more important, which came about as part of this discussion and this ruling, is this whole aspect of conflict of interest of a director who is appointed by a shareholder, whose interest that director will be usually serving. Earlier there were no specific statutory provision. Now, at least in the 2013 Companies Act, there is a specific provision of section 166 which deals with the duties of a director. Interestingly, Supreme Court does deal with this aspect of 166, and some of the observations are, in my view, very, very critical as we go along in the corporate governance of many private or public unlisted companies in India. So, as you know, there are instances where investors, banks, other shareholders have their nominees on the board of directors of a company, and the argument always revolves around what is the duty of that director, and it is always necessary that we balance the duty of the director under 166 of the Act, which obviously requires to serve best interests of the company, shareholders, committee, protection of the environment, and otherwise. And the other duty which that director also serves is the duty towards the nominator itself. And in that context, Supreme Court has relied upon two, which again, in my view, fairly debatable, to say the least, where Supreme Court has gone ahead and said that, look, there are different ways in which directors are appointed. One under 149, read with 152, and the other other is the independent directors who are appointed on a board, and where it is compulsory for at least the listed entities. And they say that if under 166, if it has to apply to every director on the board, then what is the need of an independent director? So now there is a line of argument open where there is a distinction made under this judgment, which distinction is not found under the law or the statutory provisions, which is what is the difference of duty as prescribed under 166 between an independent director and a director who is a nominee of some other shareholder. And they go ahead and say that, look, there is always, this balance and a philosophical rhetoric around this discussions. But ultimately, the director, is serving the best interest of the shareholder and also best interest of the company. And therefore, there is no conflict of interest unless, and I don't know where this unless came from. It says unless there is a siphoning off or a diversion of funds, kind of an allegation so far as the shareholders are concerned. And argument is not even relevant in this case because majority shareholders happen to be a charitable trust engaged in philanthropic activities. This raises maybe 100 questions, maybe 200 questions, right? What if those were private limited companies and not philanthropic charitable trusts? What if there were certain other allegations which were dealt by NCLT in respect to certain financing or using the funds in its own personal interest little differently? And what if NCLAT had actually dealt with those aspects which Supreme Court said that, look, we cannot go into this aspect because NCLAT didn't deal with those aspects in detail and only dealt with the aspects of removal and some of the aspects of articles which Payal and I are discussing. So I think there is a great amount of issues which now crop up as to what would be the duty of a director who is a nominee of a shareholder and how that director will have to behave when that director is sitting in a company's board where he is nominated to. Obviously, till now, there are enough jurisprudence and enough guidance that there is no difference between a director once he sits on the board. He or she has to first take care of the interest of the company, and then obviously takes care of the interest of the nominator. But in case of a conflict, company's interest trumps the nominator's interest. Having known that law and having established that law, this judgment, and bear in mind, this judgment obviously takes care of a lot of facts and a pattern of the way both the parties have behaved in this litigation, which is an overhang in that sense so far as the outcome is concerned. But at the end of the day, some of the observations of the Honorable Supreme Court can apply in general as well. And if that has to happen, then this discussion has come back in the forefront. Also seen in the recent past in the Amazon Future dispute, same 166 coming into play, and there, interestingly, the promoter directors acted very differently on the board of a company versus what they had agreed under a contract. And 166 in a way came to their rescue, that look, at the end of the day, they have to serve the interest of the company first and then the nominator. In this case, the aspects are very different. If we call Tata Group as the promoter and SP Group as an investor, they acted in a way in the interest of the nominator. That was the allegation, at least. But that decision-making authority on behalf of the nominator was not considered as prejudicial or oppressive so far as the actions are concerned. Of course, this is in the context of 241, 242 of the Companies Act, so very different parameters apply. And the case in the Amazon Future was in the context of arbitration and certain decisions taken in the board of a company. So it's done in a very different context. The other point which was raised by the SP group in.
So maybe Vyapak, I think
Yeah,
we are
okay.
4 minutes short of the end of the session. Maybe if you can just touch
Sure.
upon, you keep getting multiple requests from either PE funds or acquirers on how do we remove directors on the board. Uh, can you just throw light on, how what's the process and what are the do's and don'ts for removing a director from the board?
Sure. So I think obviously this judgment is in the. So I think this judgment obviously specifically deals with the removal of the chairman, right? And it says that the director was removed much later after the petition was filed. And therefore that issue, even if it was discussed in the judgment, it says that there were enough reasons why he was removed as a director. Having said that, I think when the issues of removal of a chairman or a board of the board or as a director comes into play, there are specific provisions under the law which requires to be adhered to. I think what this judgment gives you a clear guidance, right, is in the context of how the directors, the other directors will have to behave, right? When you are a nominee of a shareholder, just because you are a nominee of a shareholder doesn't mean that you are interested in what shareholders have, suggested or proposed for the removal of the director, correct? If it is in the interest of the company, or at least if it is not prejudicial to that extent, you can obviously deal with that situation in your own right. The other thing this judgment clearly says that even if there is an illegality in the removal of a director, or if the compliance is not properly done, right, that in itself cannot be operation as or mismanagement. What has to be established is whether the removal, whether legal or illegal, has in a way oppressed the shareholder, right? Not the removal itself. What further is oppressive, right? What is the mala fide around it? Whether any action in the past or continuous action has been taken to oppress the shareholder in the context of removal of the board of directors. So in my view, from a do's and don'ts, I think there is a clear distinction now made between the removal per se and the operation, which is a separate ground for which you might have different aspects to be dealt with rather than only deal with removal as part of the operation and mismanagement. In my view, that's the takeaway so far as this judgment is concerned. You are on mute, Nishchal.
Yeah, I think we have about a minute left, so we can take few questions before we end this session. I think one question is from Mr. Udayan Maru on what restrictions are imposed on a disgruntled shareholder or options are available to him to sell his shares. What is the acceptable valuation? Should the shares be offered first to other shareholders? And if at what price? What price valuation? I think this is very clear. The transfer of shares and the valuation is something that has to be inter se decided between the shareholders. The court will not get into the valuation and the price at which the shares should be transferred. And this is something which Supreme Court has clearly mentioned even in the current ruling, that valuation is something that has to be decided between the two shareholders. So hope that answers the question. There is another question on from maybe Vyapak, if you want to take this up.
Sure.
If a director, this is from Prakash Srinivasa, if a director is sidelined by other members of the board and the shareholders, can he have by any recourse and can his shares be divested as per rulings in the case?
So I don't think this, at least this ruling goes into that nitty-gritty specifically, because here, so far as Cyrus Mistry as a director was concerned, he was specifically removed, based on the process under the law, which was followed rather than, sidelined or otherwise. As far as his chairmanship is concerned, that was purely a non-statutory post, and it is clearly shown that if it is loss of trust, that is something which, the majority shareholder can anyways do, and there is no provision under the law protecting the position as a chairman. And therefore, it was upheld that there was nothing oppressive about it. Whether that in itself allows you to sell shares, at least law doesn't allow you specifically unless there is any article around it. You again, go back to the basic provisions of law in reference to protection of minority interest if it is not a private limited company. So that's where the Companies Act stands today.
Okay, there is one more question from Jiten. If Supreme Court had not weighed presence of charitable activity in the entire issue, would the judgment be otherwise? So I think Vyapak briefly touched upon this, but I think one argument here is Supreme Court went into the charitable aspect. But the question that arises is, what if the shareholder instead of a charitable trust is let's say a foreign pension fund, which is number of employees of the state government or the central government in that jurisdiction who are going to be the beneficiaries of that pension fund. Or what if there is the shareholder is a mutual fund where retail investors from middle class are unit holders in that mutual fund. Is the Supreme Court going to get into the beneficiaries of each shareholder going forward? Or is this something which was very specific to this case, given that all the facts were otherwise in favor of the Tata Group, and hence this was just an added observation that was made?
So my personal view, Nishchal, is I don't think it was required to that aspect to determine whether affirmative votes are right or wrong. It doesn't matter whether the shareholder is charitable trust or whether it is a pension fund or it is simply a private interest, because ultimately, uh, you know, uh, at the end of the day, it is the shareholder who is the creator of the company, right? So I think there is some observation around that also, that it is very good to know or good to wish that the creator is separated from the creation, but that's not something which happens in a normal situation, right? So I think I don't think that was required. There were other reasons on which the affirmative votes could have been upheld or not upheld. I don't know whether that situation would have changed, but this definitely takes the discussions in a tangent, which was which may be used in different ways as we go forward.
Correct. So we'll take the last question, and Shupra, if you can respond to this question. This was actually the first question even before the session started. Even the court may have upheld conversion of closely held public company into private, is such abrupt change fair, equitable, and bona fide towards minority shareholder?
Sure. Am I audible?
Yes.
So, right. So, if I understand the question correctly, and okay, let me just read it. Yeah. So, as far as the process for conversion of a public company into a private company is concerned, there are no real grounds where an abrupt change, fair, equitable, or bona fide is essentially any ground for challenge or holding against the the need for a conversion from a public company to a private company. And it really, the decision to go private is essentially again going into the same points that the Supreme Court touched upon, which is if it's in the commercial wisdom of the parties to move to a private structure as opposed to a public company, then so be it. Courts will not intervene. It is up to parties to really decide on whether or not that structure works better for them. Of course, that does not prejudice parties from having recourse to other provisions of law, like, for instance, 241, 242, which is essentially oppression and mismanagement. But conversion in and of itself is not really something we see to be a problem.
Sure. Thanks, Shupra. So I think with this, we will end the session. thanks to all of you. And, as I had mentioned at the beginning of the call, that this was a huge leap of faith taken by Mr. Ratan Tata to end the 144-year-old non-Tata Group as chairman, the journey that was there for 144 years. It was a huge leap of faith. Unfortunately, it didn't augur well for Tata Group. The question that remains is, going forward for India Inc., will this become a precedent for large Indian groups to think twice before they give the reins of their conglomerate or large groups to outsiders? And that's something that only time will tell. But as of now, we don't have a great precedent to talk about for a successful succession planning in India Inc. So thank you so much for participating and joining this session, and hope you found the session useful.
So I think just to confirm, we will be sharing the video link, recorded video link and the presentation to all the participants. So if at all something has been missed out, you can refer back to some of the discussions.